Is the world entering an age of political extremes, where wealth is divided ever more unequally? Recent years have witnessed increasing numbers of populist and extreme political groups, with charismatic leaders rising to power. The far right and the far left have enjoyed a surge in support, as inequality has continued to rise across the world at different rates and to different extremes.
Inequality has increased since the 1980s, but it has done so at different rates, with a much larger increase in the United States than in Europe. The sociologist C. Wright Mills observed that a small group of wealthy and powerful individuals controlled America's dominant institutions, meaning the political, economic, and military aspects. This elite consisted of political leaders, corporate owners and directors, and the highest-ranking military officers. Public concern about crime, immigration, economic woes, and religious radicalism has led people to begin supporting those who offer simple solutions to complex problems. It's happened before. Lenin offered peace, land and bread to hungry, war-weary Russian peasants in 2017, while Adolf Hitler promised bread and work to depression-ravaged unemployed Germans in 1933. Time and again, leaders win power by offering simple solutions to desperate problems.
To what extent does human society always arrange itself into social classes with different levels of wealth? And is there some other way to organise society which doesn't depend on existing forms of democracy? Simple questions with important answers. The far right and the far left seem to be ever more appealing to the public. Does this represent a failure of traditional politics? We asked the public. Here's what they said.
I think with social democratic parties across the world, there's a sort of groundswell of movement building and activity and activism and some policy ideas, but it seems to lack a basic thing of what are our values and what do we care about, what gives people life and purpose in the world, and I think there's a bit of thinking required there.
I think the younger generation are somewhat disenfranchised. I think as well the rise in inequality has kind of led to two completely different feelings in society of, we're not going back to the Thatcherite haves and have-nots, but there is a definite feeling of, well, this political system, this political party doesn't work for me, so I'm going to join quite a radical, ideology at least.
Unfortunately, people get quite angry and they tend to go in one direction or another, and unfortunately there are extremist views which tend to put people on one side or the other.
I think it is breaking down. Clearly it is. It's such chaos at the moment with all the Brexit stuff and everything that's going on. No one's sticking together, everyone's apart. It's just a great big mess.
Anytime you unsettle the landscape of things, there's going to be a rise in both sides. Both sides are going to come up, and the middle will be forgotten about. Do you know what I mean? Now it's basically they're putting it black and white, like you're either left or you're right. But that's not the case, I don't believe. I feel like that's always been there, but the middle ground has been forgotten, and the two towers on the either side have just risen through it.
Absolutely, because over the last 40 years, we've had Labour and Conservative governments in America, Republican, Democrat presidents, but all through that period, life has got worse for ordinary people, whilst wealth has massively increased for the richest 1%. And this has fueled anger. And the failure of traditional parties like the Labour Party or the Democrats to actually bring about change means that a lot of working class people now look for somebody who looks like they're going to bring change. Now, Donald Trump at the last presidential election was promising to do all that. He was going around working class areas where manufacturing had been wiped out, promising to bring it back. Of course, he hasn't done any of that at all. He's carried on serving the interests of the bankers. And here in Britain, we had a Labour government under Blair and Brown that didn't change any of that. And so now we're in a position where people are looking at someone like Jeremy Corbyn, who clearly is up for change, or someone on the far right like Nigel Farage.
Furthermore, it's a failure of globalized neoliberal economics. because we have seen since 91 the victory of the United States or the Soviet Union, and that created a new neoliberal world. And at the moment, this world is in crisis, and it creates a lot of inequalities. And this kind of inequalities and the bankruptcy of many political systems is pushing for the growth of some discontent, which is expressed in hatred of immigrants, and on the other hand, it's expressed in hatred of the bourgeoisie. So we are going to experience the growth of the far left and the far right in the incoming period.
Inequalities have risen since the 1980s, but at different rates, with a greater increase in the USA than in Europe. Are social classes unavoidable and even needed in society? We sought the view of the public.
Yes, to both. My limited understanding of economics, I think some inequality is healthy for an economy, from what I understand. But it seems like we're in a kind of Victorian level of inequality at the moment. So we can rectify some of the balance.
Social classes are unavoidable. I don't think they're a good thing. I don't think that there's anything that we can do to change them. I think that they somewhat have changed in the sense of there is now a larger middle class. But even so, that middle class is still saturated with different levels of social class in themselves. So it's quite difficult. I don't think we're ever going to get rid of it. I think it's a byproduct of inequality within education, educational opportunity as well is a big thing. If you haven't got opportunity, you're going to have different classes. That's just the way it's going to go, I think, my opinion.
I don't know about unnecessary. I think people are always going to find themselves banded in one way or the other, and it's people's approach to life, and I don't think it's unavoidable, unfortunately.
I think so. I'd say that it naturally happens, I'd say.
Yeah, I do think it could have been, but it would have had to have been done a while ago. And now I feel like it is inevitable. From this moment onwards, it will be inevitable.
Simple reality is, if we look back over the last 70 to 100 years, there's two phases. In the 30 years after the Second World War, we had a fairly equal economy in Britain. There was a real redistribution of wealth from the richest to the poorest, and our economy grew much better and had higher levels of investment during that period. And then Thatcher came to power, and taxes on the richest were slashed. Taxes on ordinary people, like VAT, went up massively, so inequality suddenly dramatically worsened. The 30 years after the Second World War, inequality was halved in Britain. Now it's as bad as it was in 1914. And is our economy better? No, it isn't. We've got the lowest levels of investment that we've seen. The rate of growth has been only about 2/3 what it was in that post-war period. So this growth of inequality, the neoliberal economics, has not worked. We need to go back to Keynesian economics that gave everyone a better life after the Second World War.
Capitalism needs inequality. It needs to have a class of capitalists, businessmen, and people that works. So if we have capitalism, we are always going to have inequality. But why Europe have less inequality than the United States is because in Europe has been a lot of social movements that fought against hard capitalism. While in the United States, there has not been this kind of social movements. And also, the United States ruling class is very tough regarding any kind of social movements inside and outside the country. And also, the United States is always trying to create more inequality worldwide.
In Europe, the top 1% of the population controls 12% of income. In America, the top 1% controls 20%. Elites seem to become richer the more they influence policies. Do people feel democracy is a power struggle between rich and poor?
There's a guy called Bruno Hanna, a billionaire in the States, who's like, I earn 10,000 times more than the average person, but I can't buy 10,000 suits, 10,000 houses. I can't support an economy the way that a robust middle class would. And he's like, be careful, because the pitchforks are going to start coming. And I think there's just a basic disconnection and alienation for most people from what gives them meaning in their life, and I think part of that's because of this gross inequality.
I think it depends on what political system you look at. When you look at an English political system where we do have quite strict lobbying laws in the sense of how much money we can pump into a campaign, and then you look at a political system like the US where the laws for lobbying are notoriously vague. Like, take a look at Trump's presidency. He got where he was because there was a massive amount of money pumped into his electoral campaign. So I think it's an issue. I think politics is dominated by money. It just depends on the system of voting, campaigning that kind of could curtail that or not.
I think it's probably down to the MP and what they're pushing themselves. A difficult one to answer, really, to be honest.
Is not how we originally thought democracy would be. It seems to be now it's only going to favour one person. Do you understand? So it's like we were saying about the rich and the poor, their idea of democracy is not the poor's idea of democracy, and it's contrasting views, and it's taken away from the actual word itself. Do you know what I mean? So I think I don't even know what democracy is anymore in this country, to be honest.
I think it's always been a power struggle between the rich and the poor, and the tragedy is, in recent decades, people leading left-wing parties like the Democrats or the Labour Party here have failed to challenge that. Virtually the first thing Obama did once he got the Democratic nomination, straight off to Wall Street to promise them he's not going to make any change. Here, when Tony Blair became the leader of the Labour Party, he was immediately doing a round of lunches and dinners in the city, promising them no change. And the failure to actually regulate the banking system was what led to the crash in 2008. If you actually look at the post-war world, the banks were regulated. They weren't allowed to take risks. So we didn't have disastrous catastrophes like 1929 or here in 2008. And still today, the banks aren't regulated, and we're most probably a year or 2 years away from another great crash.
I see that every society has the power struggle between rich and poor, even if it is a dictatorship. But in democracy, it is expressed in votes, in political parties, and the point is that in some democracies, like the United States, like Israel, the rich have most unlimited power, and they oppress ethnic minorities, or in the case of Israel, perhaps the majority of the country, which is the Arab population. So democracy is not an expression of this struggle between poor and rich. In democracy, we see an expression of this fight, and in terms of electoral votes, parliament, and legislation.
Let's look at those statistics on inequalities again. In 1980, in Europe, the top 1% received roughly 10% of national income, while the poorest 50% took around 20%. Less than 40 years later, the top 1% in Europe take 12% of income, while the bottom 50% get 22%. America is even more divided. Today, the top 1% of Americans earn 20% of national income, with the bottom 50% receiving just 10%, meaning the inequalities in the United States far exceed those in Europe.
New political movements are created, but old political systems seem to make it hard for them and their ideas to progress. Are new political parties the answer, or do we need a new political system? We invited the public to comment.
Just maybe not new parties, but more imagination and leadership and vision.
I think the independent group is perhaps a good thing. I think it'll be interesting to see how that fares if there is going to be a second, if there is going to be a general election. But I don't think it's a case of throwing more political parties at the mix. It's still a spectrum of ideology that ultimately comes around into a big circle at the end of the day.
I think it needs addressing. I don't know if it needs completely changing. There's a lot of history there, and it's worked historically, but I do definitely think that it needs addressing and maybe bringing it more to the public. You know, with certain votes don't seem to bring enough people to the polling stations. I think more people need to be involved in it, and that needs to be addressed for sure.
I don't think it's new parties, I think it's a new political system.
I think you'd have to change the system first because you're saying it's only ever going to be Conservative and Labour that get to be heard, is it? And I think it will take maybe years, maybe like 50 years before these smaller parties get any recognition or any say in basically what's going on. But I think it is possible, but it will take a while.
If you look at the voting system in, say, Germany, literally every vote counts equally, because the parliament in Germany, the Bundestag, then reflects the way people voted. So small parties can get in. Here in Britain, like in America, it's been dominated by two main parties, and it's completely unfair. If I think back to when I first got elected to Parliament in 1987, the Tories got 42% of the vote, but had a majority of over 100 seats. Labour had about 250, it got about 26% of the vote, but the Social Democrats got almost the same amount, but only about 20 seats. So literally, I think you have to have proportional representation so that every vote has of equal value, not just those that are cast in marginal seats.
I think that we need both new political parties and new political systems. Why? Because look in the case of the United Kingdom. This parliament has 650 places, and 90% of them are allocated to two parties that together have 55, 60% of the votes. So a lot of minorities is not being expressed. And many parties, like the Conservatives and the Labour Party, are in reality coalition of different factions that fight between each other. So this system does not have any proportional representation. The members of parliament can last for decades, even for 50 years. We have a House of Lords which nobody elected. And there is no the right of the population to deselect their own members of parliament. So I think that we need a system with more proportional representation, with the right of the population to deselect their parliamentarians, and also parties that are more linked with the population. No? Not like here, the Conservative Party only have 100,000 members, and a party of 100,000 members choose who is going to be the next Prime Minister of a country of 65 million people.
Does the public have alternatives to existing political systems which they would support?
I do feel like people need a more devolved sense of their own communities and some power and autonomy over their own lives, so we're not just stuck between a Sainsbury's and I was thinking a Blockbuster, but that's defunct, or Sainsbury's and estate agents, something that gives people more sense of identity and ownership over their own lives.
Perhaps my only issue, I do have a slight issue with the House of Lords. I think, whenever you have an elected amount of any kind of people making big decisions, that is always going to cause some kind of issues. So perhaps that could change. But I feel like it's a much deeper issue than saying democracy isn't working, because it does work in some aspects for us. Take this referendum that Cameron completely hung his campaign on, that Brexit has now happened as a result of it. A referendum isn't legally binding, but obviously it happened for a reason. So perhaps it's just, there just needs to be a new way that political parties operate, campaign, stop lying.
I do think there needs to be a certain amount of leadership, that's for sure. I don't know about complete change. I think people quite like the idea of free speech and free will, but I think there needs to be a bit of direction, and referendums and what have you are definitely key to that, but it's getting those people involved to vote for it.
I would, because some people's views are so wrong. Like, I don't think I know that they can't have everyone's views in the whole world, but I do believe that some people's are wrong.
I would try and crash down on as much hierarchy as possible. I feel like that is the division, and that is only elevating as the years go by, and you have to attack it now, and you have to cut down hierarchy. You need to let everyone have a voice, regardless of who they are, and you need to take everyone's opinions into matter, don't you, really?
I don't think there is any alternative to democracy that can work. I mean, if you actually look, you end up with a dictatorship of the left, a dictatorship of the right, and eventually either wars or catastrophic collapses. We've got to make our democracy work better. It's got to be fair. That means proportional representation so that every vote counts, but also you've got to take the media out the hands of super rich billionaires. I mean, when we have an election, whether it's in Britain or America, all these lies and smears in the media because they don't want to focus on an honest debate about what the different parties are doing. That's why here in Britain there was a real shock for the establishment when Jeremy Corbyn came within 2 points of winning, because they'd had nothing but allegations of, that he was anti-Semitic, he was a Marxist, he was going to do away with democracy and all of that. But as soon as you hit the election and people on radio and television could hear what he was saying about a fairer economy, creating good jobs, building homes, that people responded to. Nothing's wrong with democracy in principle. The trouble is, in countries like Britain and America, it doesn't function properly because you don't have a fair voting system, and the super rich elite very often have political leaders in their pocket and doing what they're told. As I said, I mean, the moment Obama got the Democratic nomination, he was straight off to Wall Street, and that's why he got quite a lot of funding from Wall Street, promising he wasn't going to do anything to upset them.
Well, first of all, the Greek democracy was based in slavery. And what we need is a much more democracy, a more democratic democracy. So it will mean that the population have more controls of the means of production and the media. Because in this country, Mr. Murdoch is the owner of a TV channel, a newspaper, the most popular newspaper. Second, we need members of parliament that are renewable every time and should be elected by some kind of proportional representation, because now what we have a lot of members of parliament that are 10, 20, 30 years, they never change. And we need that the population participate more in politics, more revocability, and a new kinds of political system which reflect more what is happening in the population. Not like we have now, a parliament with only 2 big parties, that inside their parties have a lot of fractions, and they don't give the opportunity to other alternatives to grow. The best democracy that I know was when, for example, the Native American populations, and in every country, in the past, many the native people used to have assemblies, and they decide everything in an assembly, and they choose their leaders. There were plenty of democracy. Now we have too many intermediates, so it's in reality a little bit more like the Greek democracy, which serious class divisions.
There are alternatives to the more familiar forms of government, such as cyberocracy, democratic world government, the poly-state, and legislative democracy. In the meantime, political views seem to be separating into increasing extremes across the spectrum. The far right and far left appear appealing to large groups of voters who regard traditional politics and moderate movements as failing them and their communities.
For many people, their quality of life now is worse than it was 10 years ago. It's as if wherever they live and whatever political system they live in, the powerful carry on winning and the powerless carry on living in poverty. Politicians talk about making new politics, but is this really just empty propaganda? If you're in the inner circle, the old politics is working well. But if you're on the outside, then perhaps no politics works at all.